Thank you all so much. And Michael, you can take it away.
All right, thanks, Robert. Well, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the second webinar in a webinar series between EGLE. So when I say EGLE, it's Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, between EGLE and the Stewardship Network. So a month ago, we gave a webinar on advances of wetland mitigation in Michigan, where we talked a lot about wetland banking and some of the other advances that EGLE has with templates and technology and everything. And today we're going to be talking about preservation and stewardship. So just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I am EGLE's wetland mitigation specialist. My primary role at EGLE is to administer EGLE's wetland banking program. And I also serve as the technical assistance for all district staff. So I've been with EGLE for about 8 years. I work on a lot of wetland bank projects, project-specific mitigation, preservation projects. So anything that's mitigation related. Prior to my time with EGLE, I worked for the Michigan Department of Transportation and administered their wetland banking program. So I've literally worked on hundreds of different wetland mitigation sites. And today we're going to talk about preservation and stewardship as far as how it works with EGLE. So I'm going to turn off my camera and let you guys focus on the presentation. Okay, so why are we here? I assume most of you are here because you heard about the webinar and are interested in preservation and stewardship. I think from my personal standpoint, my goals here are basically to provide a better understanding of the preservation process. So there's been a lot of changes that have taken place with how we as a department work on reservation sites and the components of it. And I want to make sure that everyone understands that. I also want to start the conversation between the stewards and consultants and applicants. So I've been working a lot with a lot of different conservancies. I talk to a lot of different consultants. And my goal here is to encourage all of those different parties that maybe don't usually talk to start talking to each other when it comes to preservation projects, so we have a more comprehensive approach. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. So basically what we're going to be talking about today, we are going to be talking about preservation as a form of mitigation. So I'm just going to give a really brief introduction on mitigation. I'm going to talk about the preservation criteria under statute and administrative rules. So in Michigan, wetlands are protected by Part 303, the Wetlands Protection Statute. So there's criteria in there that kind of governs how we process these reservation sites. I'm going to talk about the old versus new preservation process, because like I said, since I started with the department 8 years ago, there's been a lot of changes and a lot of really good modifications that have resulted in much more successful projects. And then the highlight is going to be Mitch with Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, who's going to talk about one of the first preservation projects that are using the new process, which is the Tamarax Swat Reserve. So for those of you that attended the mitigation webinar a month ago, there's going to be a few overlapping slides, but I promise only about 3 or 4. So since we are talking about wetland mitigation, I wanted to give the definition of it from the department standpoint. So basically, when we're talking about wetland mitigation, we're talking about the replacement of unavoidably lost wetland resources in order to replace as fully functional, replace as fully as possible the functions and public benefits of the lost wetlands. So we're talking about things like flood storage and groundwater recharge and discharge and wildlife habitat and nutrient removal and things like that. Like all of the functions that you folks know about, that's what the goal of wetland mitigation is. I'm not going to talk a lot about the permitting process other than how the components of a reservation site fit into the permitting process. So I'm not going to talk about avoidance and minimization and all that stuff to a great extent. So when we talk about mitigation in general, though, we do talk about what we consider a mitigation sequence. So when applicants apply for permits to impact wetlands, of course, they have to try to avoid them to the greatest extent possible. They have to look at feasible and prudent alternatives. They have to try to minimize the impacts. And after they've gone through the avoidance and minimization is when compensatory mitigation comes in. So while we consider this sequencing as what we call mitigation, what we're talking about today with regards to reservation is compensatory mitigation. So mitigation in this state is basically required under statute for all projects that impact over 1/3 of an acre of wetland and projects that impact less than 1/3 of an acre if a reasonable opportunity exists. So we do often, if there's impacts to wetlands less than 1/3 of an acre in watersheds and ecoregions that have wetland bank sites, we do often require mitigation for those also. So there is a mitigation hierarchy in this state, and that hierarchy is listed under statute. Basically, the acquisition of approved credits from a wetland bank is the first step. So if you impact a wetland in a watershed or ecoregion that has wetland bank credits, we generally require you to purchase credits from an approved bank. And as you go down the line, you then look at restoration opportunities. So restoration, we're talking about areas that were formerly wetland, where maybe a farmer came in and tile drained it and dug some ditches, and it's been farmed for the last 80 years. So it's an area that used to be wetland, but that's not currently functioning as a wetland. The next is creation of new wetlands. And what we're talking about today is the preservation of exceptional quality wetlands. So as a department, we don't often allow preservation of wetlands unless these other options to mitigate are actually exhausted. So when you look at when will EGLE accept preservation as mitigation, applicants and consultants have to go through that process. If there's no wetland bank credits that are available, no suitable restoration or creation sites, if they find an exceptional quality site that meets the criteria, then that's when EGLE as a department can accept preservation as mitigation. One thing that I did want to mention is that it's at a 10-to-1 ratio. So for every 1 acre of impacted wetland, if an applicant is proposing reservation, they have to provide at least 10 acres of exceptional quality wetland. So the basic preservation the criteria for reservation, which is under administrative rule, there's basically 3 things that the site has to meet. The wetland has to perform exceptional physical or biological functions, or be a wetland that is rare or endangered. The wetland has to be under threat of loss or degradation outside of the applicant's control, and there has to be permanent easement protection. So before we can even consider preservation, it has to meet those 3 criteria, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. So by definition, under Part 303, an exceptional wetland is a wetland that provides physical or biological functions essential to the natural resources of the state that may be lost or degraded if not preserved through an approved site protection management plan for the purpose of providing compensatory wetland mitigation. So it's interesting when you look at this definition, and I've underlined some of the essential parts, because this definition really puts the components of what we now use in order to preserve wetlands. It has to be exceptional physical or biological functioning. It has to be under some type of threat, meaning that it could be lost or degraded. And it has to have an approved site protection and management plan. And this will be important moving forward when I show you how wetland preservation used to be accepted versus how it's currently accepted. So one of the resources that we use for exceptional quality is a field guide to natural communities in Michigan, which is a Michigan Natural Features Inventory product. Basically, it looks at global and state rankings of wetland sites. When we look at this, we're looking at generally sites that are S1s, S2, and S3s are the sites that are suitable for preservation. It still has to meet those other criteria, but we're generally looking at those types of sites. So an example of an S1 site would be like a wet prairie. An S2 site could be like a coastal fen, and an S3, you're talking about prairie fens, or muskegs, or northern hardwoods, southern hardwoods. So it doesn't absolutely have to fall into one of those categories, but that's an example and a tool that we use to basically document that wetland meets that exceptional quality. So when we're talking about threats, there's lots of different threats. The image in the upper right-hand side of the screen shows an easement of an area. There could be threats from development. There could be threats from surface water runoff or threats from agricultural runoff. And I know that Mitch in his presentation is going to talk about some of the threats to the Tamarax Swamp Preserve. There could be logging, invasive species. Another threat that we sometimes allow and have to look at is the threat of like non-management. If the wetland is exceptional quality and it's being managed for something like, say, Mitchell Sater, the non-management of that site could cause the degradation of that actual resource. And then lastly, that it has to be permanently protected. So this is usually the easiest part because EGLE has a standard conservation easement. We don't generally allow many changes to it, if any. So as long as the property owner of the exceptional wetland is willing to convey the easement to us, then that usually meets that. So if you look at the old way that we used to do things, so this is like 10, 15 years ago. This is an example of a site. This is a 500-acre site that is up in Alpena County near Hillman, Michigan, which is kind of the upper southeast part of the northern lower peninsula. It's a site that has a variety of different wetlands, uplands. There's actually a nice restoration piece here. If you look at our old way of doing things, we would basically slap a conservation easement on it, and then that pretty much satisfied it. So as long as the site was exceptional quality and the applicant could document that it met the 3 criteria under statute, we would accept the site. They put a conservation easement on it, posted some signs, and then that was basically it. And while that's fine for a lot of sites, it doesn't prevent things that could happen down the road. So it doesn't prevent if that site starts to get invasive species in it. If that site, someone dumps a bunch of trash or something. So in 2008, the federal mitigation rule was adopted by the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, and that put a preference towards not only preserving these sites, but doing management at these sites. So while the old way was primarily the conservation easement, the new way also includes the easement, but it includes several other components that we look at in order to accept the site. So conservation easements are required. baseline reports that identify the quality of the sites and the communities and the threats. The applicant or the consultant has to develop management plans, and then really the stewardship agreement and endowment are kind of the last two pieces of it. So it's a lot more, not necessarily complicated now, but there's a lot more components, but it ensures a much better preservation project, because not only is the site being protected through the easement, it's also being managed usually through a conservancy, and there's funding for management and all that. So to briefly talk about each of these components, I am going to turn it over to our conservation easement coordinator, Jeff Bridgland.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Just sharing the screen here, so bear with me. Can everybody see the conservation easement signs, hopefully? All right. Well, thanks, Mike, and hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jeff Bridgland. I'm the Conservation Easement Coordinator with EGLE. I've been in the position with the state for about 1.5 years now. Prior to that, I was a wetland consultant for, geez, almost 20 years. I'm kind of dating myself, but a lot of what we did there was land management, wetland delineations and permitting, things like that. So I've got quite a bit of experience over time with conservation easements and preservation sites and everything. So one of the main roles of my position now is to process conservation easements as they come in, conduct field assessments to ensure compliance, and to just go out on site as often as possible, just to make sure that everything is up to speed and looking okay.
And Jeff, you can go ahead and go to presenter mode in that bottom right corner of there.
Gotcha.
Perfect.
Thank you. So, you know, I know a lot of you probably know a lot about conservation easements already, but for those that don't, a conservation easement is it's a voluntary written legal agreement. It's a legal document between a landowner and a government entity or a land trust that permanently restricts a property's uses for the purpose of protecting its ecologic value. So basically, the property owner agrees to give up certain rights, like building new structures, removing vegetation, things like that, but they do retain ownership of the property. So in our case, and for the case of this presentation, EGLE is the government agency that holds these easements, but theoretically, it could also be like a local municipality, a nonprofit group, a watershed council, a land conservancy, things like that, that hold an easement over a property. But for this discussion, we're just going to deal with easements primarily held by EGLE. So some of the terms that we use are grantor and grantee. The grantor is the term we use for the property owner that's conveying an easement to EGLE. So a lot of land conservancies will refer to them as the donor, but our legal agreement refers to them as the grantor, so that's what we go with. So as I mentioned, the grantor still owns the property and still pays taxes and everything, but EGLE just holds an easement over the property that restricts certain activities. So conversely, the grantee is the entity that holds the conservation easement. So in our case, EGLE is the grantee on these preservation sites. So conservation easements held by EGLE are conveyed to us as a condition of a wetlands, lakes, and streams permit. So we don't accept conservation easements as a simple land donation, like maybe a land conservancy or some other nonprofit might do. We don't get land donated to us. All EGLE easements are tied to a permit. So if mitigation is required, you know, whether that's in the form of creation or wetland restoration, or in this case, preservation, the conservation easement will be required as part of the permit. So that's really the main reason why an easement is required. It's permit related. So EGLE does not approve a preservation site unless it's permanently protected under a conservation easement. So the conservation easement is supposed to restrict use and development of the easement premises in perpetuity, so forever. This means that the property owner and future property owners are legally required to abide by the terms and conditions of the written agreement, and the easement premises itself has to remain, or is supposed to remain, in a natural and undeveloped condition. So, you know, what activities are typically restricted in a normal conservation easement? I say normal because we have normal conservation easements that a majority of our easements are what we consider normal, meaning you know, we put an easement over remaining wetlands or something like that. For this discussion, we're talking about conservation easements related to preservation sites. So what activities are typically restricted in a normal conservation easement? Pretty much any alteration that would disturb the easement premises is kind of prohibited. So activities like excavating, draining, filling, grading, clearing, vegetation removal, the use of pesticides, dumping. We see a lot of grass clippings and yard waste in some of these easement areas. So obviously the installation of homes or structures or pole barns or anything like that. So really the whole point of the easement is to keep the easement premises as natural as possible. So when in doubt, most of these restrictions are written in the legal agreement. So you can just refer to that, or you can always reach out to me as well at EGLE. So, you know, a lot of grantors see the conservation easement maybe for the first time and they think, you know, geez, can any activities occur in an easement? So the answer is yes. Even though normal conservation easements in general are pretty restrictive and they really do prohibit a lot of activities, you know, passive recreational activities like hiking and hunting and fishing and bird watching and things like that, those are always going to be allowed in an easement, really, as long as they don't violate the terms and conditions of the easement. So what that means is, you know, if you plan to hunt the property within a normal easement, you can't go in and cut lines of sight or shooting lanes. You can't create new hiking trails to get to certain areas of the property and things like that. So easements associated with preservation sites, though, these are a little different. So preservation sites require, as Mike mentioned a minute ago, they require long-term management plans and stewardship agreements, and we'll get to that in a second. But so it's basically expected that some form of management will take place in the easement premises. So these activities will need to be identified by the grantor and approved, though, prior to us recording the easement. So what types of activities do we allow on preservation sites? Well, vegetation removal is allowed in a preservation site. Usually this is invasive species control. That's the most common activity. But again, this has to be identified in the long-term management plan and stewardship plan. So most normal easements restrict the use of herbicides, but you know, kind of going hand in hand with invasive species control, chemical treatments are often allowed on a preservation site. You just have to note that the rules still apply, where you'll need an aquatic nuisance control permit. We call those ANC permits. You'll still have to go through EGLE to get an aquatic nuisance control permit if you're proposing to treat vegetation in a wetland or over standing water. Trails, viewing platforms, boardwalks, these are often allowed on a preservation site, but again, they have to be identified beforehand and they have to be included in the conservation easement exhibits. So they don't necessarily have to be installed prior to recording the easement, but like the length and location, these things have to be included in the exhibits and identified beforehand. So other activities can also be considered. It's kind of a case-by-case basis. These are the most common ones, the invasive species control and the trails and boardwalks and things like that. Those are pretty common, but there are often other activities, you know, even structures. As long as these are identified ahead of time, we can work with you guys. And the key is to plan ahead with EGLE and with the conservancy that'll be taking stewardship. So in addition to the conservation easement, a baseline report will need to be submitted too. So the baseline report is often done before the permit is issued, because the applicant has to give us enough information to justify that the site they're proposing for preservation is special, is exceptional. So what's included in the baseline report, you know, things like a wetland delineation, pretty comprehensive site assessment. Even several site assessments might be required. You know, we basically need as much detail about the preservation site as possible. So these reports need to address the land use history of the site. They'll need to include a map and classification of the different natural community types that are present. We'll need to see a floristic quality assessment, a MIRAM, which is a rapid assessment method for qualifying wetlands. And the report will need to address invasive species and identify other on-site or even outside threats to the property, whether that's, you know, things that Mike mentioned, development, logging, changes in hydrology, trespassing, any other outside activity that could negatively impact the property somewhere down the line. So in addition to the baseline report, it needs to, this baseline report, most of them, everybody does them a little bit different, but most baseline reports that we see include a short-term management plan. Short-term in our case means something that needs immediate attention. So it's nothing huge. It's usually things like putting up signs, treating invasives, cleaning up trash, maybe installing gates to keep trespassers or ATVs out, things like that. So this short-term plan needs to identify opportunities for restoration as well, if they exist even. So the short-term management plan is typically included with the baseline report, but a long-term management plan is also required. So the long-term plan is intended to address concerns after the 5-year monitoring period established in the permit ends. So it's typically 5 years. So long-term plans are usually standalone documents and are different from the baseline report, but a lot of times they can be somewhat redundant because they also identify invasive species and threats to the site and some of those things. There's a standard template we use that Mike will talk about in a minute, but you know, these long-term management plans are tied, actually everything, the long-term management plan, the short-term plans, the baseline report, this is all tied into a stewardship agreement, which I'll talk about in a second. But the long-term plan includes detailed monitoring schedules, the management plan itself that describes different invasive species control methods, timing for control, other restoration BMPs, and it usually requires or includes a long-term maintenance plan once the site is restored. So maintenance plan in our case is a little less descriptive than the management plan usually, and a lot of times just it's maintenance, you know, it's ongoing maintenance just to make sure that the property is doing okay. So these maintenance plans usually aren't too detailed. They just kind of describe how many times a steward will be on site each year, what they'll look for while they're on site, what activities they'll be doing, you know, invasive species control as necessary, like spot treating or something. They'll check signage, they'll pick up trash, you know, activities like that. So this all kind of brings us to the stewardship agreement. So the stewardship agreement is a legal document that ties everything together. So like a conservation easement, it's a legally binding document. Conservation easement is recorded first. Stewardship agreement, which includes the baseline and everything else that we just talked about, that is recorded afterwards. So this is required to be signed and notarized and recorded by the end of the 5-year monitoring period. But it doesn't have to be, and it's usually not recorded at the same time as the conservation easement. So this is a 2 to 4 party agreement between EGLE and whatever other entities are involved, whether that's the grantor, the land steward, sometimes the land steward is the grantor, and the community foundation. So the baseline report, the long-term management plan, and endowment information all get included in the stewardship agreement, and it's recorded with the County Register of Deeds. So as I mentioned, this is a legally binding document. So that's kind of all I've got right now. I'm going to turn it back over to Mike to talk about the endowment requirements because he's done a lot of work with community foundations.
Thanks, Jeff. Go ahead and advance that slide. Thank you. So when I started with the department 8 years ago, you know, it was right when these 2008 federal mitigation rule changes were taking place, and we were piecing everything together. But kind of the last thing that we needed to piece together is how are people going to fund the long-term management for these. So I was involved in several meetings, and I want to thank the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan. We sat down, talked about things, talked about how the endowments are, would work, and that's basically the route that we're taking now. Is these endowments are generally funded through community foundations. The way that it works is the applicant meets with whoever that third-party steward is. They decide what that lump sum dollar amount should be, and then that community foundation basically provides grants annually to the conservancy or conservation district or whoever that third-party steward is to do the actual management. So that's currently the last step. We spent the last 3 or 4 years working on that, and to date, it's actually working fairly well. Go ahead, Jeff. So how does it all fit together? Well, it really depends. So Jeff and I have worked on several of these reservation sites over the last few years. A lot of them pieces come in at different times. The baseline report may come in before the permit, or it might be part of a permit condition. What works best is early coordination. So if you're a consultant or an applicant that you have a project in an area that doesn't have bait credits available, there's no restoration opportunities, the whole point of this is to kind of talk to the conservancies in the area and start that conversation early, because they may be able to help you out with potential sites. They may have already done baselines and threats and all that stuff. So early coordination is definitely key. Next slide. So in a perfect world, this is the way it would work. The applicant and consultant identifies a suitable site with conservancy input prior to submitting an application. The baseline is conducted by the consultant or conservancy and submitted with the application. Conservation easement is submitted within 60 days of permit issuance, because that's what our standard permit condition says. Short-term management activities are performed either by the applicant or by the conservancy. And then, like Jeff said, during that 5-year permitting timeframe is when the applicant and the conservancies work out the details of the long-term management plan, stewardship agreement, and endowment. So in a perfect world, that's how it would work. We're definitely not there, but part of this presentation is to encourage us to get to that point. So next slide. Now comes the fun part. So you guys got through the legal part, you got through the process part. Now comes like the star of the show. So we're going to talk about Tamarack Swat Preserve. I do want to give a little bit of background information on it before I turn it over to Mitch. So the Tamarack Swat Preserve was one of the first sites in the state after the 2008 federal mitigation rule that required long-term management plan and an endowment. It's a site that MDOT met with the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy on. In 2010, there was a baseline assessment that was conducted to determine the quality of the site. And then MDOT and Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy spent a few years working out the details of the management plan and the endowment, and everything was recorded in 2014. MDOT actually provided an endowment of $151,000 and provided that to Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy to do management at the site. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mitch Lettow, the Stewardship Director of Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy.
All right. Thanks very much, Michael and Jeff, my partners at EGLE and the Stewardship Network, for coordinating and putting everything together. And feel free to give me a shout if something comes up on my screen that you can't see that I'm not aware of. and have a rare moment of sunshine in Michigan. So I apologize, I'm kind of this shadowy figure here. But at any rate, yeah, happy to be here. As Michael mentioned, I'm the Stewardship Director at the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. And so I'm responsible for taking care of our natural areas, our preserves, as opposed to our conservation easements and private lands. And I'm going to take about 25 minutes or so, and I could do an hour-long presentation on this really fascinating and great property, but I'm going to do my best to kind of hit the high points that are really relevant to wetland mitigation. And I'll just start by kind of saying that I'll talk a little bit about Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. We have this moniker SWMLC, SWMLC. So who is SWMLC? How do we operate? Many of you are probably from land trusts or work with land trusts. We'll go over that just the same. The preserve funding structure in general and for the Tamarack Swamp Preserve. We'll get to talking about the actual preserve itself, some of the natural features, some of the management history. So essentially, what have we been doing since the mitigation fund was established? Future work and ideas in terms of specifics and more generally around this mitigation program. And then we'll have some time for questions. So like I mentioned, many of you work for land trusts or are familiar with how they work. But if I could really sum up our work in one word, it would be that we protect nature. So we have a couple of tools that we do that with, but this sort of 4-panel image here really, in my mind, represents outside of the email and all the specifics of what I think about when I think about our organization and what it accomplishes. So we have, of course, Lake Michigan shoreline, dune habitat in the upper right, beech maples, spring ephemerals in the upper left. We do a lot of work around watershed planning, working along waterways in terms of water quality, and 319 grants around water quality, the Water Quality Act in the lower left. And in addition to preserving nature, we're also preserving the opportunity for people to maintain a relationship with nature. So in the bottom right there, you see a family using one of our nature preserves. And so many of these places are accessible to the public. Some of them are not, including the Tamarack Swamp Preserve that I will talk about now. And this gives you a snapshot of our service area and the kind of distribution of our preserves. So this is right from our website. It's an embedded Esri map that you can go and browse around on, see where all of our preserves are. So the preserves in green are the publicly accessible ones where there's much more information on specifics on those. The orange diamonds are our limited access preserves, which may be limited for a number of reasons, sensitive species, sensitive habitat. They may just be wetlands and not that great for establishing hiking trails for the public. They may be landlocked. There's different reasons that those might not be accessible to the public. And you can see that our distribution of preserves is not equal across our service area. We do have each county represented. From just south of Saugatuck on the Lake Michigan shoreline, all the way down to the Indiana state line in the southwest corner, all the way over to Branch County in the bottom right, up through Battle Creek, Calhoun County, Berry County at the top, and of course Kalamazoo right in the middle. And a lot of the focal areas where you see clusters of preserves are kind of go back to some of our focal projects, watersheds that we work in, public lands that we work around to leverage conservation efforts and those sorts of things. And I'll just briefly show this image. This is from the Heart of the Lakes, which is our sort of land trust advocacy body in the state. And they put this map together, and you don't need to know any specific color pattern or name here, just that anywhere you go in the state, there's a land conservancy that you could be working with, no matter what kind of player you are in this conversation. Of course, we're there in the lower left. Many areas are represented by multiple land trusts, watershed groups, things like that. So anywhere you are in Michigan, you're in good company in terms of land trusts. And in terms of the tools that we use, since about 1991, when our organization was established and was all volunteer organization, we're thrilled to say that we've protected 18,000 acres in Southwest Michigan. And it's really exciting to be working on this in 2021. And our two main avenues that we do this work are through conservation easements, which Jeff did a great job of explaining, so I'll just briefly go over that. And then nature preserves, which are what we refer to in terms of the places that we actually own, where someone is the landowner. So conservation easements, as Jeff mentioned, there are tax-based incentives. The land remains private. We don't advertise its location. It is not open to the public. And believe it or not, this has been a big bipartisan supported issue going back for years. Seems to be supported every time the legal process comes through Congress. It's a legal document that stays with the property forever, so it stays attached to the deed and the title of the land, and the language stays attached as well. Jeff mentioned the restrictions on development, protecting the conservation values that are identified in the easement, so things like water quality, wildlife habitat, those sorts of things. And by and large, this is the most popular conservation tool that we use. So 14,000 out of those 18,000 acres, 100 or so individual parcels, properties have been protected through this method. It can be passed on to your kids. It can be sold to a new landowner. In a lot of ways, it functions just like it did before the easement in terms of being able to be transferred. So it's very flexible, and that's why it's so popular. Our nature preserves, which is where most of my job comes into the picture for the Land Conservancy, are places that generally have been donated to the Conservancy, or more often have been purchased with grant funding or sold at a discount, which is considered a bargain sale. In that case, we are the landowner, which is great fun. We get to kind of decide how we want to manage the land in terms of biodiversity, rare species, forest management, those sorts of things. The lands are open to the public in a sense, but access can be limited where we have sensitive species, we have sensitive habitats. They're not particularly accessible just the way they're laid out. And that really varies by preserve, and can also just get back to the capacity of the organization to maintain public access as well. Like I mentioned, we get to manage those places as we see fit. We have a management plan for every preserve, and about 4,000 acres are protected as nature preserves, and just over 50 individual properties scattered across the landscape like you saw there. In general, getting to our preserve funding, and this is relevant just because it sort of gives you a feel for how we operate and how mitigation funds and preservation projects would come into the picture to really benefit the landowner, the natural area manager. So in general, as a nonprofit, we get most of our funds from the public, from donations. The other 20% come from grants that we apply for and investments and things like that. And so we're really supported by the community that we work in, and we're really thankful for that, of course, but we're always working to basically keep the lights on, keep the wheels turning. In terms of stewardship for those 50 preserves, for those 4,000 acres, we have 2 permanent staff, one of which is myself, another one is our stewardship specialist, Dave Brown. And we have a number of stewardship crew members. We call them the Stew Crew. They are, the number depends on which grants we have and how many individual funds for preserves we have. And that really determines how much management we can do and on which preserves we can do that. So in general, each one of our preserves sort of has some kind of status in terms of its funding. So most of them have no dedicated funding, which means there's a very large pot that comes from those donations that you see in that 80%. And that really restricts how much real active management, how much transformational sort of restoration, those sorts of things we can do. If something really important comes up, we can, of course, take care of it. But it really limits what we can do in terms of habitat restoration, supporting species that have specific needs and those sorts of things. There are some places that just don't need the management because they're in good shape, but by and large, most places we'd like to be doing a lot more than we are. So a lot of them also have restricted funds, which just means there's a fund set aside for that preserve and can only be spent on that preserve. We could spend all of it if we wanted to. Of course, we don't. But that's what a restricted fund is. So there's a handful of preserves that have that sort of status. And there are a few of them, including Tamarack Swamp, that have endowments. So there's essentially a principal fund that we don't ever lower the fund underneath, so that we can always be generating revenue to essentially support the stewardship of that preserve indefinitely. And so that's the long-term stewardship that EGLE is looking for with these mitigation sites. We also do a lot of work with grants, volunteers, and that limited general fund that I mentioned. So we do a lot of volunteer work, not as much lately, as you can imagine, but we're really a volunteer-driven organization. And we also do a lot with grants. And I think it's important to recognize that grants function very differently from restricted funds or endowments, as in the mitigation fund for Tamarack Swamp in particular. So as a land manager, having a 2-year grant versus having a mitigation fund give me two very different feelings. If I get a 2-year grant, it's scrambling to get the work done, to show the impact, to really make a finite restoration project, habitat improvement. And we all know that, you know, saying we've completely restored an area in 2 years is kind of impractical, but it does allow us to really push the envelope in terms of managing the habitat. On the other side of things, having a endowment or having a mitigation fund, like at Tamarack Swamp, allows us to make long-term goals. So it's hard to make long-term goals when you don't know how much grant funding you'll be getting, what the timeline is. But because we have this indefinite timeline, and we essentially, based on the fund, get about $7,000 per year for management of the preserve, we have a sort of known funding source and a known quantity. And so we can really spell out, you know, where can we get and how long is it going to take us to get there? And so that gives me peace of mind to know that if something comes up, you know, we can take care of it. And it allows us to sort of chip away at these goals for habitat and management over the long term. And really it's ideal in my mind to have both, to have sort of that reassurance, but also be able to have short-term funds to be doing more transformational restoration. So that's kind of how it functions at this preserve in particular. So I thought I'd just briefly talk about, when I'm thinking about a natural area that we're managing, how am I thinking about managing that place, and how am I thinking about stewardship? And this comes up in the long-term stewardship plan that we have with formerly DEQ EGLE, our partners, and MDOT, which was also involved in the transaction. So there's sort of the maintain. The picture on the lower left is a really beautiful intact floodplain forest along the Kalamazoo River. There's really not a lot that we need to do. It maintains itself, it floods, it's diverse, it's beautiful. It's kind of the don't fix it if it ain't broken moniker. And if something comes up, we're out there monitoring every year, and hopefully we can identify that, but relatively low time and resource investment are needed. This sort of middle of the road, which are what most of our preserves are, and most of them are a combination of all three, but this sort of restore, they need a little love. So in the middle, you have wintertime brush removal in a prairie fen wetland. So it's got a great base of diverse sedges and lots of forbs and just great botanical diversity and function. But it needs a push. It needs that nasty crust of buckthorn to be removed off the top to really kind of be its best self and function in the healthiest way possible. And then there's sort of these ground up places where we're doing some kind of transformational restoration, where we're really changing the state from, you know, in the example of the lower right, was a row crop agriculture field, was planted to a diverse pollinator prairie mix. And this is year one of that growing season, which you'll recognize horsetail or mare's tail, kind of an agricultural annual that popped up there. But in that case, we're going from a very different state of agricultural field to a tallgrass prairie and perhaps something else in the future. So we're sort of looking at individual preserves and individual patches of preserves with sort of those three general ideas. So finally, here's the actual preserve itself. So this is Tamarack Swamp. It's split into several parcels that are divided by, there's a railway that goes kind of diagonally through the preserve and several roads. There is a stream that kind of follows throughout the linear section from left to right. That is a central feature of the preserve. It's actually our biggest preserve that we own to date. It's 390 acres. So no small feat to really wrap your brain around managing a site like this. It is a limited access preserve. And it was transferred, as Michael said, to the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy in 2014. And the conversation around the transfer started several years before that. It's located in Cass County, so in that very southern tier of counties along the state line, kind of in the middle south of our service area. It's in the St. Joseph River watershed. So it starts in some of these agricultural counties in southern Michigan, goes into Indiana and back into Michigan at St. Joseph and Benton Harbor before flowing into Lake Michigan. And what's really cool in terms of hydrology and water quality about the preserve is that it's a subwatershed, a tributary of the St. Joe, the Rocky River, which has some sort of cold water, maybe cold transitional qualities to it. And it essentially starts on the preserve just in the upper left hand part of the image, or where a lot of those seeps in these wetlands come together to form the Rocky River. And in terms of threats to the preserve, this is not a highly active area in terms of development. Certainly that is occurring, but it's in a fairly agricultural area. So certainly agriculture can be associated with threats to wetlands in the form of nutrient inundation, runoff, just creating more edges for invasive species. Those sorts of things. But that's sort of the landscape that the preserve occurs in. And so the headwaters are in the upper left and kind of flowing from left to right across your screen. And here's kind of a breakdown of the habitat types, most of which you'll see are wetlands. So I think this is why it was probably such a good fit for this program, is that it is by and large wetlands. So you see we have different sort of management unit codes on there that correspond to the type of habitat. There's also the acreage is listed there as well. So the little key in the lower right of the map tells you what kind of habitat it is. There is upland forest, old field, and agricultural fields, which are upland habitats. And then in terms of the wetland habitats, I've kind of broken those out to the right in terms of their natural community as defined by Michigan Natural Features Inventory and the state rank. And I bring up this state rank. Michael did a great job of explaining that earlier. That's essentially something that is a consideration when identifying these preservation sites. So going from 1 to 5, 5 being very, very common, 1 being very, very rare, 3 being somewhere in the middle. I think on Michael's slide, it showed that there may be 20 to 100 of wetlands of these types throughout the state in that sort of S3 category. And I believe, Michael can correct me later if I'm wrong, but I believe they look for S3 and lower if possible. So in that sort of more rare to relatively rare category. And so a central feature of the preserve along the Rocky River are these prairie fen wetlands. We've also got southern hardwood swamp and southern wet meadow. And so those are all in that S3 category. We also have southern shrub car. So much more shrubby, more standing water, that sort of thing. Not quite as rare as the other 3. And having the juxtaposition of all these together at this site makes for really dynamic natural communities that kind of wax and wane and move between each one. And there's a lot of biodiversity, and it's a very, very interesting and challenging to walk through, I'll say, preserve. Another consideration that EGLE will be making is the rarity of the wetland type, but also the critters that live there, the inhabitants of the wetlands. So above is a list of species that are either occur there or have occurred there at some point in time. Things like the regal frillary were quite a long time ago and are likely not there anymore. Things like the Mitchell satyr were there relatively recently. We haven't seen them in several years. They're present on adjacent lands and there's potential they could be there. And there's things like some of the plants on the lower part and the reptile species that are still present on the preserve. And so of course, all of that is part of the consideration of how to manage the preserve and also how to identify these preservation sites. So just briefly go over our history a little bit. So this is essentially what have we been doing since the fund initiated. So kind of boring, but very necessary part of management is installing boundary signs, and no small feat on a 390 acre property that's 5 or 6 different parcels with roads and railroad tracks and that sort of thing. But something that is funded by just sort of maintaining that base level awareness of the preserve. We've been really active on Mitchell satyr surveys at the sites and assessments. Several years ago, there was a beaver who set up shop in one of the primary fen areas and led to some changes in hydrology that were kind of already happening. And so kind of unforeseen circumstances, we don't see satyrs in that patch anymore, but we're still managing a lot of the area as if they are there. They could pop up again. There's potential for reintroduction. So we're still managing with that species sort of preferences in mind. We've done a comprehensive invasive plant survey. And the way we generally think about invasive plants, when, as is most often the case, we're faced with more than we can really deal with, is an early detection, rapid response kind of approach. So basically categorizing the worst offenders that have the potential to create the greatest impact in a negative sense to the preserve, and really spend our resources on those. So in this case, that would be Phragmites. We have been doing some targeted prairie fen restoration as one of the really biodiverse wetland types and Mitchell satyr habitats. We've been doing a lot of invasive shrub removal and management around some of those areas that you saw in the previous slides. We've also been establishing tallgrass prairie in some of the former agricultural areas. And then last, I'll mention that we do have a hunting program on our preserves, and we do consider the hunters part of our preserve stewardship. Not only are they managing deer browse and changing behavior of deer in a way that benefits the vegetation, but they're also boots and eyes on the ground. So if there is dumping or something like Michael or Jeff were talking about, they're often out there and they can relay that information to us. So here's a snapshot of our invasive species survey. So each one of these points represents a different species and the presence of that species that was documented. So although it looks like there are invasive species everywhere, each one of these points could literally just be one plant that is a certain distance from the last one that was recorded. But just gives you a sense of how much ground we've covered and the variety of different non-native species that we found. So like I mentioned, we tend to do the early detection, rapid response, and really hone in on the species that have capacity to cause the most damage. And so I have broken out here the Phragmites, hybrid and narrowleaf cattail populations on the preserve. And that's really been the focus of a lot of the funds for Tamarack swamp. So those EDRR species, relatively low in abundance is what we hope for, but they have a high capacity to spread. So it really kind of ups the timeline for us. They degrade habitat, they alter the function of the hydrology or the wildlife habitat, and we have some known control method. So an example is Phragmites australis, common reed as it's called. I'm sure most of you are familiar with. You can see there on the right, there's our stewardship crew leader, Megan Martin. She's probably about 5'2", and you can see the Phragmites towering above her out of the picture. So we've been having to get creative with doing mechanical treatments to sort of bring the plant down to a reasonable height to actually do management. In selective areas where we have small patches or individual sprigs of it, we use the glove of death, essentially a hand swiping technique for applying herbicide. that is good when you have intact surrounding vegetation. We've also been doing backpack spraying, of course, with wetland safe herbicides like rodeo. Something else that's not in the wetlands and not funded, but some of that complementary work that sort of works in concert with these funds that I mentioned are some of these agriculture to tallgrass prairie efforts that we've taken. So in the map on the lower left, you see those pink polygons outlined. Those were agricultural leases when we took ownership of the preserve. Several years later, we transferred them into pollinator habitat. And as a first step towards restoration of those areas, they're going to reduce any impacts that those agricultural fields might have been having in terms of pesticides, runoff, nutrient inundation, that sort of thing, right along that Rocky River, that headwater that goes through the preserve. So really buffering the waterway and thinking about water quality. The upper right, I don't expect you to be able to read that, but it just shows a variety of species that we've used that have various blooming periods and colors and seasonality to them that we used in the restoration areas. And that was funded by the Conservation Reserve Program, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program. So we have quite a diversity of species out there, and they were planted last year. And just give you a little snapshot that's kind of fun. Year one, we had a lot of mare's tail out there, which is an agricultural annual. It is a native, very prolific cedar. So we use brush hogging to reduce those in the first year, reduce seeds and competition. Then in the second year, we actually didn't have to do any brush hogging at all, which is common practice. We've got lots of landsleaf coreopsis and black-eyed Susans, and even some volunteer natives from the surrounding landscape kind of filling in those areas. So kind of a complement to the management we're doing there. So I could talk about a lot more, but I'm just gonna briefly end by talking about, outside of Tamarack Swamp, some regional conservation planning efforts that we've been having, and how this sort of interplay between EGLE and consultants and the mitigation program and land trusts could operate and be more strategic and have more conservation impact. So we recently did a sort of visionary long-term planning process for our 9 counties that we work in Southwest Michigan. And we wanted to say, we're getting more inquiries every day about doing conservation projects, but we have limited staff and limited resources. How do we identify the best places in the landscape to be working for having conservation impact? And we identified essentially our organizational values in terms of ecological values, and those are water quality, biodiversity, and habitat connectivity. We found a way, working with Western Michigan University, doing a GIS analysis to put all of that together and put it on one sort of heat map of the landscape. And so we call it our resiliency because we're thinking about climate resiliency in this process as well. And the blue areas are the highest scoring or have the most of those qualities to them. The red are the lowest scoring. So you can see they cluster out in certain regions. And essentially this tells us where can we have the biggest bang for our buck in terms of doing conservation. And on top of that, we kind of used our a little bit of our subjectivity and knowledge of the landscape and areas that we work to form this idea of a regional network of different conservation lands. And so we have a series of 8 conservation corridors and 7 what we're calling biodiversity hubs. So the hubs are large areas that can support large wildlife populations, sort of have known populations of rare species. They tend to be areas where there's public land. In our part of the state, those are state game areas primarily, but also Fort Custer State Recreation Area and Military Training Center. So those are in the pink. And then connecting all those in primarily a north-south orientation, thinking about climate change and species movement, are the wildlife corridors. And so for us, this is going to be a major tool moving forward to essentially frame all of these conservation projects that we have the potential to do, and see how much of that we can do within these areas to have a greater impact. So thinking about that sort of regional landscape scale, thinking, if you want to know more about this, actually be doing a presentation at Stewardship Network Conference. So plug for that in a couple weeks here. But thinking about that, I just want to end on this idea that reciprocal communication between these groups and within this program can really make a huge landscape impact. So we've got the land trusts who, like I mentioned, using ourselves as kind of a representative, they have existing financial needs, often for places that they already own. They have a priority geography. They have places they want to be working and already are committed to certain projects. And I'm of course biased, but proven long-term stewards. We know how to take care of, restore, conduct management with management plans for these places. Working with consultants who have expertise in surveys and management that can also be doing the work in some of these places. And also some of those consultants that may be working within the banking or the mitigation program to choose wetland restoration sites. Ultimately, they need to find long-term stewards for those sites. So land trusts can make an ideal partner. And if consultants are working in geographies that land trusts already prioritize, then it can be a quick turnover and it can be a really efficient, effective program. And of course, EGLE in the middle, kind of coordinating everything with their statewide presence, knowledge of programs, and network of partners. So with that sort of brings up a lot of questions in my mind. So I'll kind of end there and I think open it up for questions, probably the plan.
Thank you very much for that, Mitch. And I will just direct our presenters very quickly to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. So you can see there, Michael's been in there answering some questions, but any that have not been addressed by the speakers, feel free to do so. So I'll let you take it away again. Sorry, Mitch, I think you're muted actually.
You are correct, I am muted. Summer asks, have you attempted to work with surrounding landowners to control the worst invasive species on adjacent land? Frustrating to work so diligently on your preserves just to have invasive seed blow or float in from surrounding properties. So yeah, the short answer is yes, we have, but yeah, you outlined the issue really well. And Phragmites in particular, we've noticed, you know, just on the other side of the road. And like you're describing, you can use all the best efforts and techniques and work really hard. And then you just get seed blowing into the site the next day. So that's constantly a challenge at all of our preserves, and our land sort of neighbor relationships are always a priority of ours. So when we first took on the preserve, we sent letters out to all of the neighboring landowners to say, hey, we know we're new in town. We know you know the landscape really well, but we're here. This is what we're all about. And in fact, on an adjacent preserve that has some high quality fen on it with some really great species, we're going to be working on some cattail, hybrid cattail control this upcoming year. So, but it is a difficult conversation. There are some folks that have a slightly different set of values. So some people, you know, like the Phragmites, they think it's really good cover for deer or other things, or they think it's kind of cool looking. Generally that happens before it takes over the entire wetland. But yeah, that's a really challenging sort of issue to navigate. So yeah, short answer is yes. Good question.
I think you have a couple other questions also in there, if you scroll up.
Yeah, so Julie says, Mitch, would love some detail about your approach for detection and mapping invasive species at such a large and complex site. How many people hours if you did return visits to an area during different seasons to find all species? That's a great question as well. So, so Julie, we had this is very much something that we would feel comfortable using our fund to conduct those kinds of surveys. Is very much within the long-term management plan. But we did have some partners. So many of you are familiar with the CISMAs, Cooperative Invasive Species Management Areas. And working with a Southwest by Southwest CISMA, they had some grant funding from the state. And in those 3 counties that CISMA works in, we were able to survey our preserves in those 3 counties in particular. And that is what funded the invasive plant survey that you saw in one of my slides with all the different colored dots on them. And I think, I don't have a great answer for you, but I think in general, you know, seeing the long list of species there, it's a really good question, because how do you sort through all that? I think a lot of the way that we think through it is, you know, we have maybe 10 different species of upland shrubs that are considered invasive. We sort of know how to control them. It's a closed canopy forest, so they're not getting a ton of light, and they're not going to be, their populations aren't going to be expanding as fast as some others. And if there's a different species in there, functionally, they're kind of in that same group of invasive shrubs, for example, versus something like Phragmites is very unique, and it's, for better or for worse, it's unique in terms of its ability to spread really quickly and its ability to alter the wetland function. And so that's really why that species stands out, as well as hybrid cattail. And also, you know, kind of having a focus on the wetlands, given the nature of the site and given the nature of the long-term agreement of trying to maintain wetland function as much as possible. But that's the way I think about it, is how abundant is the species in general. If it's something we tend to find everywhere, then if we work really quickly to remove it, it's not necessarily going to prevent spread to other places if it's already there. So honing in on those that have small numbers, have known control methods, and have a potential to spread quickly and kind of change the function in the wildlife habitat.
Hey, Mitch, there's been quite a few questions about Phragmites control and chemical versus mowing and stuff like that. And this could be maybe directed towards Jeff also. Like, what types of techniques do you guys use? And, you know, what types of considerations do you use when using those techniques as far as smaller populations versus larger and everything?
Yeah, I can try to tackle that one, or Jeff, if you want to jump in at any time, that's.
I missed part of that, Mike. I missed the last part. Are you talking about specific control techniques? Yeah,
control techniques for Phragmites. Have you guys used anything other than chemical control that has been shown to work? And
when I was a consultant, we typically used chemicals to treat Phragmites. The key to Phragmites control is timing. You don't want to treat Phragmites in the spring, for sure. The best time to treat it is typically late summer or early fall, when the leaves have fully elongated. What I found is that Phragmites, typically the seed heads on Phragmites turns kind of a deep maroon color. That's my ideal time to treat it. We usually used a 2% solution of glyphosate. So Rodeo is what we used, or Aquaneat. Those are basically the aquatic safe version of Roundup, just standard Roundup. I saw a question in there about how do you, you know, prevent collateral damage, basically, and it depends on the site. A lot of times, if this was a high quality site and we'd be treating Phragmites stems within a fen or a bog or something like that, we would use hand wicking, kind of like what Mitch talked about with the glove of death. You just have to be very careful with it, and obviously it takes longer, but there's less damage to non-target species that way. So in larger sites where, you know, the Phragmites is a monoculture that's acres and acres deep and 12 feet tall, we typically used an Argo or an ATV of some sort with a 60-gallon sprayer on it, and we just shot up and over. There usually wasn't any native species in the understory anyways, and it looks horrible in the year or two following, but it typically comes back. We usually saw sensitive fern and various sedges. Jewelweed always seemed to be one of the first ones to reappear and recolonize. Rice cutgrass, things like that. It's a long-term effort. You can't just treat Phragmites once and walk away from it. It's you're in for it for the long haul. Probably at least 5 years is what I would recommend. And over time, hopefully you knock it down enough where in year 4 and 5 you can just spot treat or hand wick individual stems. But every site is a little bit different. Most of these sites well, I shouldn't say that. A lot of the sites that are over standing water or within a wetland will require an aquatic nuisance control permit. And for more information on that, you can really just Google Michigan Aquatic Nuisance Control. It'll direct you right to our webpage where there's information on the permits and related links. So
I think it's a great description. The only thing that, I think that's kind of how we think about it, different based on density and sort of patch size. If it is scattered, you can use that hand swiping technique in the monocultures that gets exhaustive and inefficient. And another thing that we've found that we've had to do when treating it by hand is that towards the end of the season, they get so tall that not only is it hard to actually get the herbicide just from someone on foot to the top of the plant where the foliage is, where you want to be treating, but it's also unsafe to be spraying directly above your head. And so we've had to have sort of a two-pronged approach where we come in maybe June or earlier in the season and do a mechanical cut down to the ground. And then when it sets back a little bit, obviously that's not a long-term way to get rid of the plant. But when it comes back up, by the time it's late August or early September, like Jeff described, it's at a more reasonable height, 5, 6, 7 feet, and can be accessed by hand or by backpack sprayer.
That's a good point, Mitch. We've had to do that on occasion in past years. It's a tough plant. You have to respect it. You don't have to like it, but you have to respect it. It'll grow in asphalt and upland and wetland and everywhere else. It's tough to eradicate. One real quick note. I know a lot of people have used imazapyr to treat that. It's imazapyr you have to be very careful with. It's more potent than glyphosate from my experience. Instead of taking 5 years plus to eradicate it, I've seen it eradicate Phragmites stands in a year. The problem with imazapyr compared to glyphosate, though, is that it's persistent. It stays in the soil and it migrates, and it can kill trees and shrubs. So it's a pretty potent chemical. I personally used it for a couple of years in jobs that were mandated. Part of the proposal was that they required you to use imazapyr, and it was effective, but it did a lot of collateral damage to nearby trees and shrubs. So we got away from that in a hurry and basically stopped using it.
I think the other thing too is that the sort of lower impact of the rodeo or the wetland safe glyphosate, it's been kind of our approach at this site because we know that we're going to have consistent funding through the mitigation fund that we have. So in terms of, like Jeff mentioned, you can have a greater, quicker effect essentially, but there may be greater impacts to consider. But since we know we're going to own the site indefinitely, essentially, and we have funds every year to do that, it allows us to accept the longer timeline, but know that we're reducing those impacts too. So, and related to that, Dan is asking, do you reseed or count on seed bank in areas where you've cleared out Phragmites or cattails? And I'd say on this site, I didn't have time to pull it up, but one thing that we look at when thinking about wetland seed banks is how disturbed the hydrology has been. If the soil has been excavated or ditched or channelized or altered in any way, you might expect a mix of natives and invasives. By and large, I've been really impressed with wetland seed banks I think the fact that they stay permanently wet or semi-permanently wet really reduces the breakdown through bacteria, the lack of oxygen from bacteria and fungus. And so I would say wetland soils are far more resilient in terms of seed bank. And we've been really just intrigued and impressed by the wetland plants that come back just with the simple removal or management of the plant. Even sites that have some of that disturbance, we've been really impressed with what has come back. But yeah, definitely worth monitoring because that could really change. If you haven't planned for doing follow-up after invasive removal, you sort of have to get a sense of what's coming next. If you can see other plants in the understory, like Jeff mentioned, some of those sites, they don't have an understory because the invasives are so bad. But if you can see what's going on in the understory, that's what you should expect to come back. Or if you can see adjacent areas that haven't been invaded, that can also give you a good sense of what you might expect.
Mm-hmm. It's generally not quick though.
Yeah. Yep. It's the long haul for sure.
So, patience.
I did see one comment, and I think my conversations with Michael helped me understand this a little better. Someone was asking about outcomes with preservation versus restoration and creation, and why preservation isn't towards the top of that priority list. And I think, Michael, you explained that really well in terms of just essentially the concept of no net loss. And I think when you consider it in that way, it helped me understand why that might be prioritized, because I kind of, that's my default to think that the places that are already intact should be prioritized. But with a no net loss concept, I think that's right where it comes in.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, as an agency, we try to meet that goal of no net loss. Most of the wetland mitigation projects associated with permits do come in the form of purchase of bank credits or restoration. But, there's some areas of the state where those opportunities just are not available. It's very difficult to find restoration sites, say in like the Western UP, a lot more difficult in Northern Michigan. But you're exactly right, is that, we strive for the no net loss. That's why we got the ratios in place and everything. So preservation is generally the last accepted mitigation option. However, it's an option that I think when done right and done within a good plan with a conservancy is a very valid option. And like you said, it's a way to provide conservancies with funding to do some of the management that they can't do at all of their sites, or to purchase new sites.
All right, anything that we missed? Someone's asking about biological control for Phragmites. I sure hope so. I know there is a native species of Phragmites that we find at some of our sites, and I suspect they do hybridize too, but I've heard rumblings about biological controls, but that's about it so far. I don't know, Jeff, Mike, or Robert, anybody has heard about anything as of late, but I think Cornell was working on that.
Yeah, there are some rumblings about that, and there's some test sites in Ontario, and I think some in Michigan. I don't know enough about it right now offhand to talk about it, but it's out there, and hopefully, in the next few years we'll start seeing that, much like the purple loosestrife beetle, Gallerusula, to finally get rid of some Phragmites.
Great. Well, I have to say, thank you all so much. That was a really great presentation, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Yeah, I just really appreciate it. And again, my name is Rob Luzinski with the Stewardship Network, and we're happy to be hosting this series with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And you have been tuning into the wetlands. Oh, I'm forgetting the
Preservation and Stewardship.
This one's the wetland preservation and stewardship. Got me. And we can also make, I think with permissions from the speakers, this recording available, especially since it was free this workshop. So, more likely to be able to make that public. But just wanted to say thanks again, you all, and let you have the floor for any last minute thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks again to Mitch. Mitch has helped us out a lot in the last couple of months. He's a great speaker, and definitely appreciate your input and helping us out again. So thank you, Mitch.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Mitch.
Likewise. Yeah, towards the end of the conversation, just thinking about working together in lockstep. I think there's a lot of opportunity across the state to be doing this stuff. So yeah, right back at you guys.
And thanks for organizing it, Robert. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I'll just end by saying Mitch gave us a shameless plug for the Stewardship Network Conference happening at the end of this month, January 27th, 28th, and 29th. And I put that in the chat if anyone wants to check it out. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. See you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.